Okay, let's get started. This is the 96th Security Thought Leadership webinar, and we've been here every Tuesday and Thursday since March last year, where we've been examining a topic of central interest to the security world. And don't forget, the idea of thought leadership is that we critique today what is going on in order that we may have a better type of provision tomorrow. And the idea of these webinars is not to try and solve problems, but to try and increase thinking about them. What are the ideas? Where are the issues? How can we begin to explore them and analyze them and interpret them? And the topic today, I was greatly helped by my colleague, Caitlin McGeer, who's doing a study, a PhD actually in modern slavery. And it was with conversation with her that provoked this subject matter and this idea. And she suggested 3 panelists, and I wrote to all 3, and they all said yes. And I'm delighted once again to have an expert panel. As is our way, as many of you will know, what we'll do is we'll first of all invite the panelists to introduce themselves. And once they've each done that, we'll invite them to make their opening statements, 3 minutes, when they get to say whatever they want to about the topic. And when they've done that, we'll come to you, the audience, to ask questions and to join in the conversation debate. Can I ask you please to use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen, the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. Get your questions in early and we will endeavour to incorporate them in the ensuing conversation. Without further ado then, let's go to our panel and invite them to introduce ourselves. And let's first of all go to Tony.
Hello everyone, my name is Tony Dunkley and I'm the founder and director of Illustro Consultancy Limited, which provides international training, research support and educational services to prevent, identify and deal with modern slavery and human trafficking. I have 15 years security experience, with the last 10 years focusing on trafficking in persons, originally as an anti-trafficking detective in the UK, followed by as an independent training provider in the British Overseas Territories, then as a lecturer at the Institute of Criminal Justice Studies, University of Portsmouth, and for the past 3 years as an international law enforcement advisor on trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants to the United Nations Office in Drugs and Crime in East Africa.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Tony. We've got a bit of buzzing in the background. I'm not quite sure where that's coming from. If I could just ask panelists to have a quick look, that'd be great. Well, that's stopped. Thank you. Tony, thank you very much indeed. And from Nairobi to Oxford, Lisa, please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Martin. Really pleased to be joining you all today. My name is Lisa Sin. I'm the AHRC researcher on modern slavery here at the University of Oxford, working for the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights. I was a former corporate lawyer for about 9 years of my life before I decided to go into academia and research. So I'm specializing in the area of business and human rights, which combines both my interest in human rights and also my expertise in business and corporate law. So really pleased to be joining the conversation today. Thank you.
Lisa, thank you very much indeed. So we'll go from Lisa to Andrew. Andrew, can you introduce yourself, please?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Andrew Wallace. I'm the CEO of an anti-slavery charity called Unseen, based in the UK. My background is corporate and public sector before I founded the charity. I chaired the Centre for Social Justice report, which was the catalyst for the Modern Slavery Act in the UK. And I bring about nearly 15 years worth of experience to this topic.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. Right, without further ado, what we'll do is we'll ask our panelists to make their opening statement. 3 minutes when they get to say what they wish to about this topic matter. Back to Tony. Tony, your opening statement, please.
Okay, thanks, Martin. So the title of the question that we were posed was Tackling Modern Slavery, Whose Responsibility Is It? And when we hear the term modern slavery, for those that have worked in this field for a while, that sort of word, that phrase, we understood and what it's mean, but it's probably a good idea at this point to bring in a definition. So to be honest with you, there's no clear definition at the moment, a universal definition on modern slavery, but what we can do is revert to something called the Slavery Convention 1926. So that's where the status or condition of a person over whom any or all the powers attaching to the right of ownership are exercised. So long story short, what that basically means is people treated like objects and owned as such. So when we talk about modern slavery, we have that idea of the slavery definition in mind, but there's also other things that come into mind as well. Other terms that you may or may not have heard of, such as human trafficking and forced labor and those sorts of things. So for, human trafficking, for example, there is a definition that many countries have signed up to called the Palermo Protocol, which the United Nations came up with, obviously with signatory parties and ascension countries who've now brought that into their domestic legislation. It's a very long-winded definition, but broken down, there's basically an act, a means and a purpose. So there's 3 elements to this Palermo Protocol. So basically, people can be recruited through deception, coercion, and other illicit means. They're then moved to another place where they are exploited, and that's human trafficking. So that might be a term you've heard before. So when I look at the question, tackling modern slavery, whose responsibility is it? The term tackling to me denotes something that's happened or is happening. So whose responsibility is that? But I think if we take one step back, we probably have to look at the factors that create an environment where slavery can exist, and perhaps look at whose responsibility is to prevent these conditions from existing. So what we have is sort of generally 10 conditions that we normally see are the ones that exist in whatever environment where human trafficking, slavery, and other sort of exploitations flourish. So we have conditions such as poverty, high unemployment rates, forced migration, natural disasters, political instability, corruption, lack of basic human rights, gender inequality, discrimination, lack of educational opportunities, and other indirect things that sort of go alongside of that. And it creates this environment where people are more willing to leave their home country or their town, city, whatever it is, in search of a better life. And this is where someone comes along who deceives them, coerces them, and says, well, if you come with me, I will take you to somewhere better, where there's better education, where you can remit the money back to your home nation, to your family. And that sort of idea of being able to do that is very, very powerful. So who has responsibility for taking care of those issues? I'd probably point to government, as always. It's the easy point. But things such as natural disasters and otherwise, it's difficult to blame them for everything. However, those sort of conditions, if they can deal with those in the source country, as we call it, the country where people are recruited, then perhaps they wouldn't be so willing to go along with these ideas and promises that traffickers make. And then if we sort of revert back to the tackling modern slavery, the things that are ongoing or about to happen, I think it's probably split into two, or I would split it into two, and it's probably those who have a mandated responsibility through law, and others perhaps with an ethical responsibility. So mandated, you could look at the UK, for example, within the criminal justice. So the police, more recently under the Modern Slavery Act in 2015, which incorporates customs and excise, immigration services, and so on and so forth. They have a mandated through law to deal with these issues because it's a crime and they have to deal with it as such. But then you can also look at businesses. So businesses, more and more so in the UK and more and more so around the world, are now having mandated human rights due diligence requirements. For example, in the UK, under the Modern Slavery Act, there's a section 54, which states that any company that turns over 36 million or more has to produce a publicly accessible statement to say what it's done to try and prevent modern slavery in its supply chains. And today, with coincidence that it happens today, is that the EU Parliament voted for corporate due diligence along entire supply chains, which includes UK businesses, and they voted for that today. So it's becoming more and more apparent that these issues are going to have to be dealt with by companies. So you also have the Voie de Vigilance in France, the Modern Slavery Act in Australia, California Transparency Acts in the US, and so on and so forth. So these things are becoming more and more apparent throughout the world. Alongside that mandated, you've also got care providers, social services councils, housing, and others that sit alongside law enforcement in the referral mechanism of those that are potentially victims of trafficking in the UK, and where similar referral systems happen in different countries. But again, it's very sporadic as to how that is dealt with. It's dealt with differently in different countries. And then finally, the ethical responsibility. So if a supply chain is likely to or may have slavery within it, then is it a consumer's responsibility? What due diligence or in assessing the supply chains of the clothes they buy or the food they eat, where does it lie on them about what sort of due diligence and investigation they may do to see where these products come from? And then I'd probably put, again, on parental responsibility when we look at children, is specifically on online exploitation, so where children are recruited online or groomed online and then moved into in-person meetings where children could be taken to other locations and exploited. So parents have to keep up to date with what's happening with the children and how they're communicating and what platforms they're using. So I'd like to say everyone's responsibility, but I think that the reality is those that are mandated and those with an ethical responsibility as well. Thanks, Martin.
Tony, thank you very much indeed. Let's go from Tony to Lisa. Lisa, your opening statement, please.
So so much. I'm going to have to shout a little bit because I've got a hailstorm happening in the background. I hope you can all still hear me.
Yes, I think we're sorting it out in the background there. I think we may have solved it, but let's hope.
Good. So I think Tony's touched on quite a lot of what I might have already planned to say, but I think he's absolutely right. Modern slavery is a multifaceted problem, so it requires really a multifaceted solution. So the quick answer is everyone is responsible. But I think when we talk about responsibility, we do need to be a little bit more specific as to what we're really talking about. So is it a responsibility to prevent? Is it a responsibility to avoid? Or is it a responsibility not to perpetuate? And I think as a lawyer and a legal researcher, I'm concerned with all of these. I think once we've broken down what it is that we should be responsible for, then we might have a chance at identifying who. And so through the work that I've been doing for the Modern Slavery Policy and Evidence Centre here in the UK, I do have two issues that are particularly close to my heart. The first is concerns the transparency and supply chains provision, which is section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act 2015, which I know Andrew actually pushed for when the act was going through Parliament. And then the other concern, section 45, which is the non-punishment clause, which exempts potential and actual victims of trafficking and modern slavery from criminal penalties, which they incur as a result of their circumstances. So with section 54, as Tony's already said, it really only covers large companies. And at the moment, the only requirements here are procedural. So publish a statement, have it signed by a director, put it on your homepage, which is great because actually it's really raised the profile of modern slavery within corporations and really shone a light on supply chain practices. But for the last 5 years, what we've really seen is a disengaged government. The monitoring has been effectively outsourced to civil society organizations. And here we see that there is a disconnect in terms of what government understand and what is actually happening on the ground. So I think civil society alone cannot monitor the activities of businesses. So I would say right now, the responsibility to do more really rests on the government and on businesses in relation to this particular provision. On non-punishment, I think there's a real problem in our criminal justice system as well. A recent case study revealed that despite the exemption, people who become criminals under force as victims of modern slavery are simply not being recognized as such due to a lack of knowledge and an inability to recognize indicators of exploitation. So the responsibility falls on not only the Crown Prosecution Services, but also on defense counsels, police officers, and others who have worked in this space as well. I think just more generally, as consumers, employees, investors, and citizens, the ways to ensure that people don't fall into traps of modern slavery really goes beyond the basic requirements. So as I said, the problem is really complex. Many of the issues are underpinned by structure and practice, and I think we need to be a lot more innovative in the way we solve these problems. So the law is really just one tool. Especially, I think, during this pandemic, we've seen quite a lot of these issues come to the fore and inequality sort of exposed. So I really look forward to the discussion to come, but I will leave it there for now.
Lisa, thank you very much indeed. That's just brilliant. And so just say to the audience, if you'd like to get your questions in early, as several of you have already, we'll endeavour to come to those questions as soon as we've heard from our last panellists. Andrew, your opening statement, please.
Thank you, Martin. The joy of going third is both Lisa and Tony have nicked all your punchlines. No, what I want to come back to is a different definition of what modern slavery is, because I think that helps us understand what's going on. So for me, modern slavery is an illicit commodity trade. The commodity is a human being that's bought, sold, and exploited in order to generate vast profits. And the ILO, and this figure is 10, 15 years out of date, estimate that the profits from slavery are somewhere north of $150 billion profit per annum. And to put that into context, that dwarfs Apple or Facebook or Google even combined in that whole process. So it's a vast financial criminality that's going on. The reason people engage in this illicit trade is because there are the high profits and there is a low chance of prosecution. So it is high return, low risk of prosecution. So what it's actually all about, what we're talking about is an economic crime. And whether it's forced labor, sexual exploitation, forced criminality, domestic servitude, or organ trafficking, it is all about the money. Now, it is a supply and demand trade. And what I mean by that is that we have created this demand and an insatiable demand for cheap goods and services and labor. And I can say this having worked in the commercial sector, which is we have educated the consumer, whether it's B2B or B2C, in demanding cheap and demanding as much extractive profit from the equation. You push that into the system and you create the space and the vulnerabilities for people to be exploited. And then, as Tony and Lisa have said, the supply is an endless supply of vulnerable individuals, whether that's due to persecution, migration, climate change, war and famine, or just wanting to advance yourself economically. That creates that vulnerability that traffickers prey on, and they have a business model to put it into. So to make this really uncomfortable for all of us, because actually it should be an uncomfortable subject for all of us, to answer the question, who's responsible? I would say we're all responsible. And let me illustrate this. The fact is, we are all sitting here wearing clothes, thank goodness. We have all consumed food today, and we are able to communicate via consumer electronics to this webinar. By doing nothing other than those three things, you are connected to 40 to 60 slaves worldwide who have, dug things out of the ground, manufactured things, everything that touches our lives. So actually, we should never lose sight of that this personally touches our lives, whether or not we are actively engaged in the buying and selling and exploitation of people. We are complicit in that. And then, as Tony eloquently unpacked, and Lisa's alluded to it as well, government has gone south in terms of ensuring that we've got an adequate response to this. But whether it's businesses, public or private sector, we are all engaged in a system that has allowed modern slavery to come back 230 years after its abolition. Back to you, Martin.
Thank you very much indeed. Wow, is my wow. Well, look, we've got lots of questions in. I would encourage you all to just get your questions in early. We'll endeavour to put them towards the panel, because I know today people are asking sort of questions where they come from not being clear what the issues are, rather than being clear and wanting to get an insight to it. So let me go first to Tony. Tony, I got a question from Dennis Shep, who's from Canada, who's spent 8 years working in the Middle East and in countries that seriously abuse expats in certain nations. Essentially, it was slavery, the way they treated those workers. What will change organisations in the host countries to stop that practice? I suppose, Tony, first of all, do you agree with Dennis? And second, what are your thoughts on that? And I'll come to you, Lisa, after. You're on mute, Tony. Tony, you're on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, so thank you for the question. It's not a matter of agreeing or disagreeing, it's fact, the point that's been raised here. So what can a host country do? Well, I can tell you that a lot of host countries where they are source and then the transit or destination country is Middle East, they are deploying law enforcement officers, NGOs who specialise in this at ports, so at seaports, at airports, to try and talk to people prior to them going to these countries where they are generally exploited. And what is also happening is partnerships are occurring between source and exploitation countries with law enforcement. So that's ever increasing as well. We will also deploy specialists at the receiving ports. But that's only one thing. So that's trying to prevent and also prevent at the other end as well. But there's also other things that come into play, such as the visa ties. So a lot of these countries basically have worker visas that tie a person to a single employer during that term of contract. So if they leave that employer in the Middle East or wherever that the country is where they are going to work, if they leave them, they can effectively be arrested as illegally in that country. And that threat or veiled threat is given to the person who's come over. So unless you work the hours that I've set you, unless you do it for no pay and so on and so forth, I will report you to immigration and you'll be arrested. And without knowing the language of that host country, without knowing the law enforcement and all the other practices that could actually help them if they went to the police there, they're fearful of that because of the threats that have been made and also their fear of law enforcement from their own country, who they may never ever go to. So a lot of factors come into play, and you mentioned Middle East, we see that a lot, but things are being done. Thanks, Martin.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's just get your insights and I'll come to Andrew and then we'll move on to the next question. Lisa, your thoughts?
Again, I agree with Tony. It's not a matter of agreeing and disagreeing. For me, modern slavery, in terms of how I view it, it is an umbrella term, and underneath it is a range and a spectrum of behaviors and practices of exploitation. So we have the extreme end of slavery in its traditional form, where there's possession. But then on the other side, we've got much milder, apparently, types of symptoms, such as, taking a passport off someone, or not allowing them to leave for breaks, requiring people to wear nappies just because there's no time for opportunities to go to the bathroom during work. I mean, all of these activities actually accumulate, and then over that sort of spectrum, you actually realize that people shift in and out. It can increase in terms of gravity, and then it can decrease within a given week. So I think this sort of thing is much more dynamic and much more insidious than we might sort of initially think. And it needs people who have an open mind as to the type of practices that fall under this umbrella to be able to really cure it, I think.
Okay, thank you. Just give you a chance to comment on this, Andrew, because I guess it's a scene-setting question.
Yeah, I think just two quick things. I think one is, and Lisa's right to say, and Tony's right, in terms of modern slavery is not legally defined. It is this umbrella term, and all of the things that we talk about, whether it's sexual exploitation, forced labor, etc. There's a continuum of and a gradation of what that exploitation is, and at some point it tips into. And if you want to sort of rough and ready, it doesn't always hold true. And I'm conscious that there's a lawyer in the room. But actually, is that person free to leave that situation without fear of reprisal? It is often a good sort of line to say when you've crossed that line. I think the reason that the term modern slavery came into existence, and I don't want to do one-upmanship with Barack Obama, but at the Clinton Global Initiative in 2012, Barack Obama, when talking about human trafficking, said, actually, let's call it what it is. It's modern slavery. It's the commodification of the human being. It is denying that human being their human rights. It's not the same as chattel slavery as we saw within the transatlantic slave trade. It's morphed and changed, through the years. But in essence, it's the denying of those rights. And then just to pick up on what Tony said, in terms of all those things that in terms of a Gulf state, in terms of that psychological control and psychological manipulation of victims, you see that regardless of the type of exploitation, you see that around the globe. So it isn't something which is peculiar. What's peculiar to the Gulf is this tide visa, the kafala system. But what we see is victims consistently controlled by psychological means. So the transatlantic slave trade was sort of famed. We saw the shackles. We now often talk about the psychological shackles that hold people, that mean they are not free to leave that situation. And whether it's true or not, they are in fear either for themselves or for their family of the reprisals of leaving that situation. And that can be everything from physical violence to debt bondage and many other points in between.
Okay, let's move on. Very, very interesting. I'm going to come to you first, Lisa, on this one. Ewan Grant works in London. He says, I have worked in the European Commission law enforcement programs in Eastern Europe. The multiple scandals at EU Frontex came as no surprise at all. How confident are you that all the national and multinational lessons of the Vietnamese victims tragedy have been identified and will be learned? They have to be identified first. So I'll come to you first, Lisa, then you, Andrew.
Yeah, identification is extremely important as a first step, but I think this is where I'm seeing quite a lot of discrepancy in terms of practice. So it really depends on how well trained police officers are, really depends on how aware of these issues some of these defense counsels and prosecutors are. So sort of reverting to my expertise, which is looking at Section 45, I sort of think that a really sweeping set of training needs to happen actually across the board, because there isn't an idea of how to identify victims. And I think this is partly the real issue here is victims look like criminals, and so there's a presumption of guilt almost when people approach those sorts of situations. One of the cases that's recently come out from the European Court of Human Rights is a criticism of the UK's handling of particular underage human trafficking victims who were found on cannabis farms. So when they were discovered, they were immediately charged and then they were prosecuted, notwithstanding the fact that they were underage, that they displayed very obvious signs of being trafficked, did not have the language skills to be able to fend for themselves or to seek help. But here we have a situation where people sort of do assume that there is a degree of mobility and a degree of autonomy, because they say, well, you had a mobile phone, and so therefore you should be able to call people. That's not the case in reality, really, because actually when you have a mobile phone that is actually being paid for by the perpetrator of the crime of modern slavery, then you don't have that freedom. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, I guess Andrew Dennis's question is about how we stop this. Andrew, your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think Dennis is referring to the tragedy in Essex where 39 people were found in the back of a trailer. And I think the first thing to say is that actually that was a case of smuggling and not trafficking. And I think it's really important to distinguish between the two. They're linked, but they're very separate. So smuggling is a crime against the state. You're paying somebody to get you across an international border, and it's a transactional relationship, and then that relationship ends. However, once you put your life in the hands of smugglers, you do become vulnerable. And we do often see then people that are smuggled then end up in trafficking situations. Trafficking is a crime against a person. It is taking that person, as I said, turning them into commodity, buying, selling, exploiting, and taking control of that individual. I think the other issue here as well is this intersect between immigration and trafficking. Trafficking is a crime. It is not illegal to be an immigrant. It is not illegal to migrate, and the world is on the move. And I think that's really important. I think what we see both at an EU level and now the UK is outside of the EU is this conflation between the two issues. There's overlap, but they need to be treated separately. You're dealing with a crime against an individual that you can deal with their immigration status later. As has already been said, but often, when people are brought into a country, they're then told, look, you're here illegally, or even if they've come in legally, they're then told, your visa doesn't apply to this, therefore you'll go to the authorities. So exploiters will build up this narrative that further isolates people. And Lisa's right, I think this misnomer that victims can both self-identify and ask for help that bubble needs to be constantly burst, but they can't, they're trapped, they're unable to do that. Or actually, and this is where it gets really shocking, is the situation of exploitation that they find themselves in is better than the situation that they were leaving. And I think that tells us something about the problems in terms of the push factors. And then we get into the macro, the disparity between the developed and the developing world. The fact that the developed world sort of shares its wares and its wealth, or doesn't share, correction, it showcases its wealth. Therefore, we shouldn't be surprised. And it was asking about Vietnam. A lot of people do end up in trafficking situations from Vietnam, but actually their driver was initially economic. They wanted to be able to support themselves and their families. Or they were trying to deal with a situation of debt bondage that they found themselves in Vietnam, fall into criminality, and then move to the West.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Tony, let me come to you next, and I'm going to move on, if I might, because we're getting a lot of questions and we are gaining on in time. Chris Jacks has written in, and he says, asking about the Modern Slavery Act and the key accreditation organisation process, and the extent to which this is becoming more commonly requested. What are your thoughts on how that is working, Tony? Are you able to just make a comment on Chris Jack's question?
Sorry, just to clarify, Martin, accreditation by a company that it has looked at and provided.
We've used SEDEX or Bureau Veritas as the example.
Sorry, say again?
SEDEX or Bureau Securitas as the example.
I'm sorry, yeah, of course, yeah. So looking at supply chain due diligence, bringing in third-party companies and otherwise social due diligence, yes.
Right.
So does auditing have a place within this? Now, there's a debate that goes on and on. I would argue that auditing is part of the solution. I don't think it should be scrapped. I don't think it covers everything. Auditing is often something that happens once a year with at least a month's notice on some occasions, where things can be put in place to hide whatever conditions or bad conditions may be within a factory, within any supply chain. So I would, it's like, if you have a crime occurring, you don't phone up the location and tell the criminal we're coming in a month, just to let you know we're going to come along and have a look at things, and those sort of things. So I'd argue probably that auditing has a place, but I think the methodology of how it's conducted can be very, very difficult. I think if it's improved slightly, such as using electronic validation systems to check identifications, if it's done for those workers that perhaps are a little less literate in about a means of communicating with them when they can provide real responses without fear of revocation, and all those sorts of things, I think it would improve it greatly. I don't think it's the one-stop shop, the be-all end-all of how to solve this, but I think it's part of the solution if improved.
Okay, you're just nodding in the background, Lisa. Did you want to come in there?
Yeah, if you don't mind. So I would just say accreditation is something we do need to be a little bit careful of, because they are static. They're one point in time. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, the modern slavery situation is constantly shifting, and it's always going to be on the move. And people find ways to get around audits, and they find ways to get around mandated or formalized processes. So this is the nature of the problem. So we need something that's a little bit less, well, accreditation may be one way to go, but I don't think it's the ultimate solution. And I don't think it should be looked upon as if it is the sort of stamp of approval that definitely this product is slavery free. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. And I think that was the point that Chris Jacks was getting at in the question. Andrew, I'm going to move on, if I might, with you. Keith Nielsen's got a question, Andrew, and he's changing the emphasis to the voluntary sector. And I'm interested in this because I'm not so sure we've touched on that too much so far. And he said the voluntary sector is doing a lot of on-the-ground work in this area, particularly the Salvation Army, in conjunction with the government. How do you see that? Where do you see this fitting into the large picture? If I can ask you to address the voluntary sector, I mean, presumably they've got different roles. Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can probably segment the voluntary sector response to modern slavery this way. You have the vast majority of organizations that are advocating for change, whether that's legislative change, change in business practices, etc. So, if you want to be crude, lobbying for change in that whole process. And as of yesterday, incredibly successful in persuading the European Parliament to pass mandatory human rights due diligence without any changes, which was extraordinary. You then have a smaller segment of NGOs on the ground that are working directly with victims. So the consequences of modern slavery and helping people recover. And then you have a few organizations, mine would be one of them, that sort of straddle both in that whole process and are working with different key actors, whether that's government, business, blue light agencies, and the public in terms of raising awareness. NGOs are critical because, if you like, they are society's conscience and society's voice to business, to government, and all of those other agencies. And they're also specialists in terms of the knowledge that they have, and it's incumbent on them to share that knowledge with other actors in order to inform them. So, for example, say with policing, if you think of just the average, and Tony will know this, the average police officer on the beat has got to sort of maintain a library of sort of what all offences are, and will not come across modern slavery offences day in, day out, whereas specialist NGOs are dealing with that all the time. Or governments, who often sort of just, live at the surface level, need that engagement of NGOs to understand in depth what's going on, whether that is ensuring that there is a trauma-informed response to victims in terms of both how they can relay the information in terms of what's happened to them and what is that route to recovery. It's NGOs that can bring pressure to bear on companies in terms of actually consumers, and as NGOs, there are alternatives to an extractive profit model of business that creates the environment for modern slavery to occur. So they're absolutely critical. And if you look, say, from the UK perspective, it was NGOs that led the call for the Modern Slavery Act, off the back of the report that I chaired. It is NGOs that are providing the first line response to helping victims recover. It is NGOs that are working increasingly with businesses to help them improve their response. So yes, they have a critical role to play.
Andrew, thank you very much. I'm going to move on, if I might, with the questions, panelists, because we've got a lot coming in. I'm going to come to Lisa, you one, if I might, as a lawyer. The question is from Usman Malik. Is bribery worse than slavery? I guess the point is the follow-up bit from my point of view. If not, then why has the government not followed the bribery regulatory model for modern slavery? I suppose there's some assumption that that's better, but I'm not so sure that's been working very well either. We've had a webinar on that a few months ago. Lisa, just a comment on that for Usman Malik, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, sure. So the Bribery Act model was initially contemplated as one of the models that the Modern Slavery Act transparency provision can also adopt. So having this idea of tone from the top, having this idea that, you know, the senior executives would eventually sort of bear the burden of that. I think that ultimate model wasn't adopted, partly because something that sort of stood alone under its own sort of heading of modern slavery was more attractive to the government seeking to want to be sort of world leading in this area. So that was sort of put aside. But you're right, Modern Bribery Act is also something that has kind of slightly fallen off in terms of effectiveness. If people want to sort of look at how effective the Bribery Act has been, it really does come down again to the enforcer. So whether the authorities are actually pursuing or investigating these issues really requires a lot of engagement, a lot of follow-up, and a lot of resources. Now, I'm personally sort of just trying to get the government to even just the first stage of that in relation to Section 54. So right now, as I said, the Modern Slavery Act is not monitored at all by the government. The latest announcement is that they will be establishing a modern slavery registry, which has previously been run by civil society. There will now be mandatory reporting categories. So again, this is all improvements which have come partly as a result of international pressure, because the Australian Act now has so many of these better features. The UK Act certainly doesn't want to fall behind. Another really interesting quirk with the Bribery Act and the Modern Slavery Act is actually they share the same definition for a large company. So many of the companies who sort of looked at the Bribery Act and looked at the Modern Slavery Act actually thought, oh, if I decide that I wasn't going to fall underneath the Bribery Act definition, then I really shouldn't be publishing a modern slavery statement either. So there is this sort of uncomfortable legal tension that exists, which, you know, hasn't been fully explored, I don't think, and probably needs to be more well researched. But there is an overlap in terms of how people understand the two provisions, but they do target quite different things. Although, again, in terms of subject matter, when you look at sort of bribery, sometimes it's very often linked to human exploitation as well. So the two things are linked.
Lisa, thank you very much. A good question, Usman. Thank you very much indeed. Tony, I'm coming to you for this one. This was also sent in advance, by the way, but Carl Thomas has asked it. What extent has Brexit and COVID-19 pushed modern slavery down the corporate agenda? Or to put it another way, these two dynamics, to what extent have they had an impact? Can I actually be fairly concise, Tony, because I want to get a couple more questions in, please?
Yeah, of course. I mean, if we're looking at companies and what impact that has, I mean, I'd probably say limited in the UK, at least that we've heard about. But if you look at overseas and what happened in the garment industry in Bangladesh, you know, with sort of Boohoo and others taking away all those contracts and leaving effectively half the population unemployed and during COVID to sort of save the investors and save the shareholders, then that sort of demonstrated or highlighted, if you can call it a positive of COVID, what certain companies or how they operate on a completely unethical basis. So I think in terms of companies, something like that, it did highlight. But then when you look at away from the company side of thing, and again, I'll try and be quite concise, what it did do, COVID, particularly in the UK and others that have gone through lockdown, and I know this because I went back as a COVID cop during lockdown 1 in the UK, is that it made it very obvious of certain kinds of trafficking. So I'll give an example of, and Lisa touched on this earlier on about criminal exploitation, young kids or sort of under 18s who'd been used for county lines. And for those internationals watching, we refer to county lines as basically young children are recruited and then forced as drug mules to go across regional and borders, etc., which we have as counties in the UK. So that became very obvious because no one else was on the streets, no one else was on the roads, no one else was on the trains. So you could see that, and again, if you could draw a positive from it, that became very obvious. And I think certainly in the force that I went back to and others across the UK, those sort of rates of identification went up. However, and again, Lisa mentioned it very well, is that actually what they're still treated as are suspects, are those that are causing criminal activity rather than the victims. So again, it's one of those issues.
Goodness me, some of these amazing, really. Andrew, just a quick question from Frank. Well, it's not a quick question, it's a long question, but I'm going to ask you to be quick if you wouldn't mind, Andrew. Frank Seyer, S-E-I-E-R. Frank, I'm sorry if I pronounced that name wrong. He's asked about, as a number of the questions are about good practice, if I could refer that to Andrew. A number have pointed to the fact, the international dimension here. Where do we look for good practice? Which countries got good practice? When you're trying to identify large complex supply chains, where do we look? It's a ridiculously big question, Andrew, for when I'm going to say, can you take a minute to answer? Good practice, where might we begin to think about this on this global scale?
I think when it comes to businesses that are actively working through the ILO principles around decent work is the initial first step. Allied to that, also a commitment to a contextualized living wage paid all the way down the supply chain. And then an active engagement with what we call worker voice. So actually hearing from the front line of what's going on, and then a commitment to transparency and it being led from the board. So I think if you can tick those things and evidence those things, then it's good practice. I think for businesses as a whole, the question I always ask them is, what is your attitude to modern slavery? Is it when or if? If you're in the if camp, you're in trouble. If it's the when, then actually that is going to lead you down the right path and commitment to that. In terms of sort of what is good practice in tackling modern slavery around the globe, there are bits that you can point out. So actually at a European level, even though I'm hugely critical of the UK government, and as you'd expect me to be as an NGO, actually at a European level, how the UK deals with victims is probably, you know, at the top, and also in terms of identification as well. I think at a European level, there's a real fixation around sexual exploitation and a sort of stick your head in the sand when it comes to forced labour. In terms of sort of legislation, I think what we've seen through the pandemic is the US's use of the Tariff Act has actually brought about really rapid change to business practices. You know, we saw it within the PPE scandal, we're seeing it now with Uyghurs in Xinjiang, actually across the whole of the Chinese business model around that. But we've also been aware of practices at home which may not necessarily hit the threshold for modern slavery, so Leicester and the Boohoo scandal around that. So I think you can point to sort of high points in various places. Is there anywhere in the world that I would say that they've got it all together? No. Are we making progress? Well, I think we've made some progress, but my fear is that things are slowing down. And to end on a gloomy point, you know, SDG 8.7 by 2030, we haven't got a cat and health chance.
Oh dear. Okay, just one final question, Lisa, very, very briefly, 30 seconds if you wouldn't mind. A lot of questions here about definitions from Jeff Norman, from Simon Chan. And I guess the question is, what if you haven't got a definition and you're not clear what it all is and you haven't got a united approach around the world, it starts with a definition, doesn't it? So very quickly, if you wouldn't mind, what's the barrier to agreeing a definition?
Wow, that is a difficult question, but I think my personal view is that because it was a term of advocacy to begin with, modern slavery was a term of advocacy, as Andrew has explained, it means that actually it's been quite good as a broad approach. It means that people can fit what they believe to fit under that umbrella. So actually, if we look at it from a criminal law perspective, it's been extremely good because actually, you know, you've got that broad ambit and it's not limited. We can, of course, identify particular crimes such as human trafficking, such as, you know, wage theft and various other problems under that umbrella. So there are legal definitions that exist within that. So it's not like we're completely without help and without, you know, a harbor, but I think the broad scope of this area has been really helpful in terms of highlighting just the extent of the problem. And I wouldn't want to limit that. A definition sometimes, as nice it is to have certainty, it's not helpful. So I would encourage people to think broadly, to think in terms of a spectrum, and to really look at the underlying issues that really create modern slavery, rather than to hone in on the specific elements of what will actually qualify a person to be that or this. So that's where I would go.
Lisa, thank you very much indeed. Tony, thank you. Andrew, thank you. Absolutely fascinating conversation. So we could have got on many more questions from the audience. Unfortunately, we've got to stop it there. I guess it's always a good sign when there's more to be done. Really, really, really insightful, and clearly a major issue with much complexity, signs of good practice, signs of hope perhaps, but a lot more to do. And once again, we come away with this impression: if you run businesses well, then you have good crime prevention built in, or good modern slavery built in when it's run well, perhaps. Okay, thank you very much indeed. That's just a few final comments from me, just to remind you around the world, the outstanding security reform entries are still open in South Africa, Kenya and Romania, and they will open in other countries soon. So do make sure that you get your entries in as soon as you can, please. Just to remind you all that we're here every Tuesday and Thursday, and we're back on Tuesday, where we're managing the impact of suicide. Colleagues, clients and society, a chance really to find out some of the issues that are confronting those on the front line, where we've got suicide specialists, those who manage suicide generally, and those who are specialists in the security world. So I hope you'll join us for that. And next Thursday, the move to a cashless society, the societal and security implications. They're next week's webinars. Thank you once again very much indeed to my panel. Thank you once again to the audience for your input. I must say a special thanks to my colleague Caitlin McGeer, who helped me to put it together, and to Christine Brooks and Hannah Miller, who do so much behind the scenes. Most of all, I do hope that we'll see you again before too long. I'd like to think it will be Tuesday at 3:30, but until then, and wherever you are in the world, thank you and stay safe.